This is my homemade electric go-kart. So it started out as a kid's pedal go-kart. It had those wheels, and I had initially tried to do a chain drive system. So I had used that motor, but the chain that went onto there kept getting out of alignment. I tried printing these things, but that wasn't enough to keep the chain on, and just kept coming off, and that just wasn't really working. So I had a friend who had a hoverboard that he tried to modify, and he didn't modify it quite right, so he messed up the main board, but he let me have it, so I took off these motors. So the proportions on it aren't great right now because of how big the front wheels and how small the back wheels are, because it intends to have wheels that big on the back. And if I give it full throttle and the battery's full, it'll sometimes flip over if you're not leaning forward because of the not very well balanced frame. It is powered by a 40-volt cobalt battery, which is 10S, or I can run it off two 18-volt drill batteries wired in serial with this jumper cable. I had initially, with the earlier motor, I had tried clamping it onto the frame and clamping the frame to move it, and that made that section of the frame weaker, which eventually cracked, so I put this bracket over it, which kind of holds it together, but it's not a great solution. And currently the only brakes are regen braking, triggered by this button here. I tried to rig up the old handle brakes where this handle pulls them with a wooden block because these wheels are smaller, but the block just kept rotating backwards. When I initially tried to do this with the gear-driven motor, which was 350 watts and brushed, I had tried to use this voltage regulator here to avoid over-discharging the batteries because I didn't want to buy new drill batteries. Each of these hoverboard motors are 350 watts about each, so it was too much for this thing to handle. So now it just works as a voltage meter, so I know how much I had left. And also, when I've run these batteries low before, at their lowest charge, the thing is barely moving, so it's basically unusable. Now that the battery's connected, and I'm in a place where I can drive it, we can see that the voltage meter reads about 41 volts. It seems like the cobalt battery chargers don't charge them all the way up to 42 volts, so they leave about 10% off the top, and I think that's to get the most cycles out of the battery. Now that it's on, the throttle makes it go forward. And if I put the throttle all the way down and I'm leaning backwards, it'll wheelie, and if I'm not careful, it will flip over. When the battery is lower in charge, that's not as big of an issue. These are my brakes. Sometimes the brakes only activate one wheel. Sometimes they activate both because the wiring on the wheels, like one of them, the ESC, isn't wired very well to the brakes. The other one always works. Either way, it stops enough to be safe. For the max speed test, I'm gonna track it with GPS off this watch. It just wheelied. So that got to 13 right there. There was a slight downhill, but that's about what I've gotten it to before, 12 or 13. I feel like the ESCs are limiting me there because I think the motors have enough power, just the ESCs will limit their max speed. But either way, for this go-kart's frame, it's about as fast as I would want to go anyways. In terms of off-roading, it can handle some gravel, but the main thing is to keep the momentum up so that it doesn't stop. These hoverboard tires are pretty worn down, so there isn't great tread on them. And the clearance is also pretty bad. I don't know if you can see that very well. It does have a sort of built-in suspension with the bracket flexing, moving the whole frame. So when I'm going over bumps like this, when I go over bumps like that, I can feel it flexing under me, but it does actually help dampen some of the bumps. So it wasn't intentional, but it does help out. Another thing is these tires, both on the front and on the back, are solid rubber. And now I understand why most tires are air-filled. Sometimes I tow a wagon with air-filled tires behind this, and when I've ridden in that behind it, it is so much smoother, just the air on the tires. Another issue with this is the back wheels were initially mounted straight, but the not so great thin steel of the kids pedal go-kart isn't holding up very well, so the wheel's kind of tilting sideways because I don't have another point to put 2 more bolts through there. I could probably have an attachment go from here to here, but I haven't done it yet, and it hasn't quite broken down completely yet. The way the wiring works is power goes from the batteries in this box to an XT60 connector that goes to both of these ESCs. These ESCs have 3 wires that are the main power wires, and then 5 sensor wires that go to these motors, because these are brushless censored motors. It also has wires that go up to this thumb throttle to sense the amount of throttle I'm trying to give it, and to this button, which triggers the braking. And like I said, one of them only sometimes gets stuff from the button. The only other wiring on this is the wires that go from the battery to there, so I can see the voltage, and those are these wires. They're really big gauge, they're 8 gauge, so it is overkill, but it's the only thing I had at the time because I used all the other stuff, and I had such a short length of it that it wouldn't really be useful for anything else anyways. It is very loud and bumpy off-road. So earlier both wheels were working in the braking. Now only the right one is, but that's fairly normal. Usually it only works on the right one. But as a test of the max braking while only one of the wheels works, I'm going to go down this hill at full speed and then push on the brakes. So as you can tell by that video, when I'm going faster, the brakes do a lot to slow me down. But when I'm going about 1 or 2 miles per hour, they don't do much. But at that point, I'm going slow enough that I can just put my foot down to stop me. Some other features of this go-kart are if I turn too sharp and my feet are up here, which is the only real place to rest them, then that kind of rubs against my leg both ways. So I can't turn super sharp when that happens. There's the not intentional suspension, And then there's also, oh, yeah, the semi-loose seat that came off more from last time because the bolt went through the plastic on the seat, because this seat is hollow, so it went through the plastic on one side. Hadn't done that when I started riding it today. Those are all the features of this go-kart, and there are probably a lot more that I can't think of right now, or I'll discover later. So going up a steep hill, it goes about the same max speed, but currently that's reading about 37.1 volts. But if I go full throttle, it reads around 32 volts or 33 volts. And that's because of lithium ion battery sag, which is when they're under a load, they read lower than they actually are because the voltage is being drawn from them. And now it's kind of popped back up almost where it was. Another thing that just happened is the back wheel was tilting a lot before, but it's gotten so bad that sometimes scrapes, this part here sometimes scrapes the ground when I go over bumps. So I have to find a way to fix that, or I'll scrap this just to get the wheels and ESCs out of it, because it has many issues. I ended up having to push it for about the last 300 feet to my house. So the scraping got that bad. I'm not exactly sure why it's so much worse on this side than this side, because this side is starting to have an issue, but nowhere near that bad. So this is my homemade electric go-kart.